Shabbat Shalom. This sermon will be incomplete by necessity and by choice. By necessity, because there is no way to capture the amount that we witnessed, the stories that we heard, the tears that we shed on our 3-day experience in Israel this week, an experience that was both far too short and in some moments unbearably long. And incomplete because I am just one of the 13 participants in this leadership mission from Temple Emanu-El, and you will have the opportunity to hear from other participants as these weeks go on. And incomplete by choice, because there are times when silence is the only way to honor overwhelming pain. In Leviticus chapter 10, when Aaron's sons die, bringing a sacrifice to the altar, Moses responds by trying to offer an official explanation. But Aaron's response is deeper, truer, nobler. The Torah's description is simple and profound at once. Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. Or in the Hebrew phrase we heard again and again this week, Ein Milim, there are no words. There are no words, but words are all we have, so here goes. Inspired by the possibility of seeing Israel at this critical time through the eyes and experience of our wonderful Shlicha, Aya Margalit, we put together a small group of executive committee and board members along with staff for a 3-day leadership solidarity mission. This was not a roving geopolitical seminar. It was a series of human encounters. I'll have little to offer tonight in terms of strategic insight or political positioning, because that was not the purpose of our trip. Instead, it unfolded one encounter at a time, one Israeli heart at a time, one expression of grief or stubborn resilience at a time, one hug at a time, for the Israelis we met and for each other. We met with people who lost children in the attack on October 7th. We met with family members of hostages. We met with Bedouins who saved Jewish lives, and an Arab Israeli whose life work has been to create shared society, who simply in who he was has reminded us to never forget the humanity of the other. We heard from Asaf, one of our security guards, who had his own story about dancing at the Nova Festival until dawn, and then running for his life, and who says he will not stop dancing and going to music festivals. We met with Rabbi David Azulai of Kehilat Yozma, our partner congregation in Modi'in, who is somehow still teaching Israeli kids to sing with joy. Because of Aya's relationship as a teacher of children in the region, we had the terrible honor of visiting kibbutz Nir Oz, where 1/4 of the members were either abducted or murdered, where Hamas killed residents and then torched their houses. The victims were whole families or grandchildren visiting their grandparents for the holiday, a security guard, an infant. The houses charred, melted, defaced. A Dali nightmare, where what is supposed to be straight and standing has melted over the edge of our comprehension. The devastation was almost impossible to witness, shattering violence in a series of still lifes. But this was not still life with apples or still life with melon or still life with basket of fruit. This was a still life of life interrupted, snuffed out in a moment and in the midst of everything. As one of our participants said, what we saw felt like a cross between Auschwitz and Pompeii. Still life with melted plastic chairs, death and remnants of life in awful juxtaposition. A wheelchair, a walker, a pair of sneakers, a sukkah still standing from the day of Simchat Torah. Different titles for these portraits of inhumanity and vile destruction. Ruins with basketball hoop. Ruins with bicycle. Ruins with stuffed animal. The mailboxes at the kibbutz are now marked with an identifying slash of tape under the names. Kidnapped, murdered, or freed. As witnesses, we faced a common moral challenge. Ethicists warn against what is sometimes called disaster tourism, how to look without rubbernecking, how to bear witness without intruding, how to be there for their sake and not to satisfy our curiosity, how to be a witness and not a voyeur. What saved us from those pitfalls were two things. First, our own constant check-in on humility and intention, on seeking out both the evil and the holy. And second, the spirit of two remarkable women, our tour guide Maya Yechezkel and our own Aya. What could have been analytical or statistical or just ghoulish was made personal at every moment. We didn't just look at those mailboxes. Aya told us a story about almost every family they represented. Aya helped us understand the shattering emotional toll on every displaced person in Israel, evacuated from their homes and with uncertain futures. Aya helped us understand the searing destruction at Nir Oz, but also helped us understand that at her kibbutz, near Yitzchak, just down the road, where the destruction of property and loss of life was less dramatic, it was no less significant, and the devastation runs just as deep. Not all devastation is visible. And Maya made sure we approached every experience in emulation of her own humble spirit and open heart. In some ways, our trip was like visiting a mourning family during Shiva. We came to offer condolences. We came to lend our support and yours, just by being present. I cannot begin to describe how the brutal fact of the hostages is top of mind and center of heart for Israeli society. We arrived on the 100th day of captivity, a day marked throughout the country with rallies of solidarity, prayer, protest, and song, with increasingly urgent and angry calls for the government to make the freedom of the hostages its highest priority. Every Israeli has family or friends who were killed or taken in this catastrophe or who have fallen as soldiers. And every Israeli knows the names and the faces of those still held captive, knows what day of captivity we are on, knows the story of the grandchild or the grandparent or the musician or the artist, the mother who was killed saving her child, or the youngest hostage, redhead Kfir Bibas, who turned 1 in captivity this week, and whose birthday was marked across the country with birthday cakes and orange balloons. Love and protest and pain. Israeli families are united in yearning for the return of their own and yearning for the return of every hostage. That is just one element of the dramatic unity of Israeli society in the face of this horror. Partly for their own coping and mostly to be of help, every Israeli has become a volunteer. In the first days after the attack, blood donation lines were 3 hours long, and people stayed instead of coming back tomorrow because they needed to be with each other. On Nir Yitzchak, we met Ilana, who lives in the north, but who moved south to be near the kibbutz to help out at the kibbutz dairy farm and make sure the cows are still milked. Israelis have been coming to hotels to help with the laundry of the displaced persons who were staying there, have been making sandwiches and packing food boxes and helping with agriculture. Because so many of the folks who usually do these jobs are dead or missing or serving in the army or displaced and caring for their children. In the absence of effective government response, Israelis have been stubbornly present for each other. Carol Troen, the mother of someone killed on one of the Gaza kibbutzim and who described her own loss as a forge in which all the dross is burnt away, told us of answering the door to the soldier who had come to confirm that her son and daughter-in-law had been killed. Her daughter and son-in-law had been killed. She looked at the soldier and said, "It looks like you could use a hug too." There will be a time for official investigations. There will be a time for political repercussions for this astounding failure of security before the attack and government response following it. There is time in every moment to acknowledge the truth of Palestinian suffering. And what cannot wait is the struggle to free the hostages. And what cannot wait or be denied is the stubborn and generous resilience of the people. Person after person described the inspiring will of Israeli society, even as they rebuked the government for its failures. Person after person facing the most devastating loss said, "We will be back," and looked for the next person to help. On the last day of our trip, Karine Sigal, a leader on the staff of Yozma, told us that her son, the very day we were meeting, had his first day of leave from serving in Gaza since the conflict began. He spent it going to visit the families of the soldiers in his unit who fell on October 7th. At that same table, we met with Colonel Yaron Shavit of the Jewish Agency, who said to us what has become clear to more and more Israelis is that we are not going anywhere and our neighbors are not going anywhere. Maybe once we confront that truth, we can make some progress, because we have no choice. And at that same table, we spent time with Rabbi David Azulai, a recently ordained Israeli Reform rabbi who works with the school kids at Yozma. We'd already toured the preschool and watched as kids learned about recycling, a skill you don't teach unless you believe in a future. Back at the table, Rabbi Azulai, who is also a talented musician of Mizrahi descent and has begun to introduce Mizrahi melodies into prayer at Yozma, took out his guitar and taught us to sing one. Learning a new song, a skill you don't develop unless you believe in a future. It reminded me of this week's parashah, Parashat Bo. There in the book of Exodus, with the 10th plague underway and the Israelites preparing to flee to freedom, the Torah pauses to tell us how to observe the first Passover, the first celebration of freedom designed and described before the slaves have even left. It reminded me of a verse from that description of this future festival of freedom. We're instructed in how to respond to our children when they ask the meaning of the festival. The Torah says that the people bowed low when they heard the description of the sacrifice and the angel of death passing over. Rashi says they didn't bow low in gratitude because of the description or the story. They bowed in gratitude in response to the good news that they would have children in the future who would be around to ask the question. It reminded me that the departure from Egypt is introduced in this week's Parsha by the phrase, Vayehi b'chatzi halayla, and it came to pass at midnight. The Exodus begins when the light of freedom has not even shown itself. Hope is born out of darkness. And it reminded me of a particular picture that I think a number of us on the trip took. We were standing inside of one of the ruined homes in Kibbutz Nir Oz, and through the shattered window was the most beautiful blossoming tree, brilliant red with a splash of orange flowers nearby. The jagged edges, the rubble, the life. Maybe that is what still life means. That in the midst of this horror, there is still life. That in the song of the school children, there is still life. In the will of the people, in the hearts of Israelis and Palestinians who want peace, in every volunteer act of love, in every donation, in our hearts that span the oceans and the ages, there is still life. Still life in our hearts and in our song.